one of the most important people in the history of Israel, a unique prophet in that almost every other prophet except his successor, Elisha, depend upon their words, written words and spoken words. Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. What we have of them, and remember about them, are the things that they said. With Elisha, it's more what he did and his actions. Because he lived at a difficult time in the history of Israel. If you remember, the promise to Abraham was that the people of Israel would be a mighty nation, all nations would be blessed by them. And so they all looked forward to a time when that would come true. When Israel would be more than a collection of just 12 tribes, but would grow and have that kind of power and influence and affluence and security, which proved to be so elusive throughout its history. In fact, there's only a short period of time, less than 100 years, that you could say Israel was a united kingdom at all. Under David, whose victories were primarily military ones, and then under his son Solomon, who was a good administrator, brought the people together, but wasn't particularly faithful. After Solomon's death, the kingdom begins to disintegrate. His sons divide it into two parts, and they are almost constantly living in fear of those around them, who have coalesced from tribes into nations, and from nations into empires. And so little Israel, divided, small, isolated, without any real adversaries or allies in their struggles, finds itself in a position where it is living in fear. Into this situation, a new king comes named Ahab, and he decides that the way to deal with the situation is to intermarry with a Gentile queen. And that if he does this, and the resulting political alliance will provide some security and some peace. But Jezebel is not Jewish. She is a worshiper of the Baals, which are Canaanite gods. And this causes some conflict for the people of Israel. Not the least of which is because in the ancient world, what united the people was their religion. And if you remember, people who were in positions of power and affluence and ruling because they were divinely appointed. So if you didn't share the same religion, that may be a problem in terms of your acceptance of the king and the queen. It was Elijah that stood up in the midst of this situation and proclaimed the message of Israel, which was a message of radical monotheism. The Shema begins, "Behold, the Lord your God is one Lord." And so Elijah was constantly proclaiming this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the face of this multiplicity of Canaanite gods. Last week we heard the story of a showdown on Mount Carmel between Elijah and these prophets of Baal. This week is actually an earlier story, and it begins with Elijah hearing that there will be a famine in the land. Goes to the king and tells him about this famine. The king doesn't pay any attention to it. And now when the rain has stopped and the crops have dried up, Elijah is sent to a woman who lives in Zarephath. Zarephath is not part of Israel. It's part of the city-state of Sidon. It's not Jewish in religion or culture. And yet, this is the place to whom Elijah is sent. As he goes into the city, he finds this woman collecting pieces of wood for a small fire and asks her for something to drink. And after she brings it, he says, "Bring me something to eat, a piece of bread." She says, "I don't have any bread. I've got a small jar of meal. I've got some oil. I'm going to make a fire. I'm going to cook for my son and myself. And then that's it. There's no safe way we're going to get food. So there's no food to be had. And there won't be for a while because there's been a famine. So the crops have dried up. The food is all gone. There's very little hope for the future. And she recognizes that and says, after we eat this, we're going to die. And we know it. And so Elijah, remarkably, with a fair amount of chutzpah, asks her for some of the cake that she's going to make. And she gives it to him. And then as the story goes on, we learn that day after day, the bread and the wine are replenished. They do not exhaust themselves, and they survive the famine. Which sounds like a kind of happily ever after story, until the very next paragraph, and we learn that this woman's son has died. And we don't know much about her except that she is from Zarephath, that she's a widow, and this is her only son. In a culture when women were not very high on the social scale, they had very limited opportunities. They depended upon men for their existence, for the things that they needed to sustain their lives. And when a husband died, often the widow depended upon the family, someone else, and the charity of someone else for her survival. But in this case, there seems to be no family. There's just this widow and her son, who was the hope for the future. If there was any way to get out of her situation, and for things to get better, it would only come through this son. And now, he has died. And what is her response? Why have you come? To remind me of my sin, my son dies. She blames herself. And in particular, she sees herself as broken and sinful, and somehow God is punishing her. Which is a very common human response. When something happens that is out of our control, especially something which is a crisis or is devastating in some way, we want to figure out why it happened. And the downside of that is we want to blame somebody. What did they do wrong? In this case, the woman says, it's her sinfulness that's to blame. We live in a long tradition of seeing relationship with God based upon what we deserve, or we think we deserve. And so, the message for many of us, and for many generations in the church, was that God would either punish you if you were bad, reward you if you were good. And therefore, to receive a blessing from God, or to even receive the love of God, or relationship with God, you had to be worthy of that relationship. In fact, in the older prayer book, the ordination service said that. The bishop asked the congregation, was this person worthy of ordination? As if that could ever actually be true. We are never worthy of the grace of God and the love of God. It is a gift that is given to us. It's not based upon whether we think we deserve it or not, despite the teaching of the church for generations. It is something that God gives to us because he loves us. She's asking a very common question, a question that you may have asked at some point in your life. But it's the wrong question to ask. Because it's not about what she did. This is an opportunity for God to work. We don't know why the son died. Got ill, passed away. That's not the work of God. It's the work of bacteria, or it's the work of disease, or some kind of illness. There is no morality to illness. Cancer, heart disease, any kind of illness is absolutely amoral. Doesn't matter who you are. There's no morality to it. And we try and assign it in some way. Exactly what she did. It's her sin that brought this on. But in fact, the presence of God is what transforms the situation. Elijah goes in, prays, and the son is brought back to life. Because that's what God does. God brings life out of those situations. And light out of those situations. And for all of us, there are times in our lives when we ran up against something that we could not control. And was frightening, sometimes devastating, and almost always causes grief. And in those situations, we have choices. We can look for someone to blame, or we can blame ourselves. Or, like this woman, we can have the faith to trust that God can make a difference. That God can bring life out of death. Transform the situation. Now, there is ultimately no happily ever after in the story. That's where the story ends. But as time goes on, the widow dies, the son dies, the son dies. But at this point, God made a difference. God brought life out of death. God took a situation that was out of control and brought hope. The same kind of thing happens when Jesus enters the Sea of Nain and finds a young man that has died. There's no elaborate prayers here. He simply touches the bier and commands him to arise. And I love the fact that he sits up and starts talking. Because so typical of an older teenager. They're always talking. So that's exactly what he's going to do. Sit up and start yakking. Again, there's that transformation of a situation which no one can control. Life coming out of death. God making a difference. In many ways, the people of Israel looked at Elijah as a hero. He stood up for God. To Abraham, to the king and to the queen. He suffered the consequences for that, by the way. He was that voice crying in the wilderness. But the real hero in our lessons this morning is that woman who had the faith to give what little she had to somebody else and share that. And the trust to believe that God would be with her. She serves as an example for us and an inspiration. When we run into those things in our lives that are like that family or like the death of that son, to realize that God can bring us to life, can transform that situation, and can make a difference.